So let's get started with the COVID stuff because we've had lots of questions about boosters over the last few months, and we finally have an update. So I'll give that to you first, then we'll get into some of the more sex, gender, reproductive health stuff. So on the booster front, the question here is, what are the latest recommendations? So we did have an update in the US, and there are 3 groups that should be thinking about shoring up their immunity with a booster. The first is adults 65 and older. If it's been 4 months since the last dose, you are now eligible for another bivalent booster. People who are immunocompromised after 2 months or more since your last booster, but in consultation with your doctor. There's a big part of these guidelines is to give more power to the patients and in consultation with their doctors to make a decision that fits them. So you are also eligible for another bivalent booster. And people age 6 and older who have not yet received any bivalent boosters. So if you had a monovalent booster but not a bivalent, you are also encouraged to go get a bivalent booster. And on the flip side, there are no further booster recommendations for people 6 and older if you've already gotten an updated mRNA vaccine. So unless you're in one of the previous categories, over 65, immunocompromised, no further boosters recommended at this time. And for younger children, multiple doses continue to be recommended and vary by age and vaccine and which vaccines you received previously. One last thing to note is that the monovalent mRNA COVID vaccines are fully retiring, and the US is exclusively switching to mRNA vaccines. So in general, those nerdy girls are pretty happy that these guidelines are a little more permissive and give more choice to vulnerable people and their clinicians. And we think that, likely things are heading towards something similar to a flu shot where you have an annual cycle with, again, different strategies for people who are more vulnerable. This is a similar approach in places where I am, in Canada and other countries. So I'm going to drop the link to a post for you to learn more, because I know there's a lot of information here and it's a little bit overwhelming. So let me just drop that into the chat, which will show up on some of these channels. So that's the COVID stuff out of the way for today, and now we can get into some juicy topics. So let's start with, I'm going to mispronounce this, but I'm going to try. Mifepristone. What is going on and why is it in the news? Did I get it right?
You did it perfect. You did it perfect. So Mifepristone, it is a synthetic hormone. That means it's made in a lab outside the body, and it is used to block 2 other hormones that our bodies make, progesterone and cortisol. I'm going to be focusing mostly on progesterone today because that's why it's in the news. Progesterone is our home hormone that is responsible for many activities in the body, but today we're going to focus on its role in pregnancy. It keeps the uterus from contracting. So the medicine Mifepristone blocks progesterone and allows the uterus to contract. Why would we want the uterus to be allowed to contract in early pregnancy? Well, there's a few reasons. We're going to concentrate on 2. Number 1, in the cases of miscarriage. So I just want to start by saying that 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage. That is 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 pregnancies. So it's quite a few pregnancies that end in miscarriage. Sometimes the body releases the embryo. That's what we call those bunches of cells up to 8 weeks of pregnancy. Sometimes the body releases the embryo on its own, but sometimes the body needs help. If the body needs help, we as clinicians can prescribe the medicine Mifepristone along with another medication called misoprostol. This duo is more effective than misoprostol alone in helping the body finish the process of miscarrying. The other reason we prescribe it is to help end a pregnancy before 10 weeks. Same principles. It allows the uterus to contract. There is another way it's used. It's used in something called Cushing disease to block cortisol, but I'm not going to talk about that today because we don't have that much time and it's not affected by what's been happening in the news. Can you still hear me? I just lost audio. I'm going to keep going. Let's see. Give me a thumbs up if I should keep going, Dr. Davis. Okay, so I can't hear anything, but I will keep going. Okay, so where was it? I'm not going to discuss Cushing disease because that's not a usage that is being affected by, thank you, thank you, Chana, by being, it's not being affected by anything happening in the court system. So to answer the question, why is it in the news? Well, in early April, a US district judge in Texas ordered the FDA to stop its approval of Mifepristone. In very simple terms, he questioned whether the medication is safe and effective. Well, we have 23 years of data on this medication, and the science is clear. This medicine is safe and effective. A week ago today, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a 7-2 ruling, protected the status of this medicine for now. They pushed it back to the lower courts. So again, for now, this medicine is available as it has been for use up to 10 weeks of pregnancy. That's counted from the first day of your last menstrual period, not the day of your pregnancy test. It is available by mail and it can be used for miscarriage or ending a pregnancy. It will be in the news again, though, because this hasn't gone away. It's just going to go be processed through the judicial system in the lower courts. If the FDA is forced to disallow its use, it will affect people in all 50 states because this is a federal ruling. It will affect people who are having miscarriages. Again, that's up to 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage. Not all of those need intervention, but some do. It will affect people who want to end their pregnancies as early as possible in the most effective way. And it'll affect pregnant people who want to end their pregnancy without surgical intervention. It will not affect people with Cushing disease. And that's interesting because the federal judge in Texas carved out a special protection for use in Cushing disease. So the bottom line is, if you're of reproductive age, you're sexually active, and you do not want to be pregnant, make a plan now. Talk to your clinician and partners about birth control. There's the IUD, intrauterine device. We have posts about that on our website. We have oral birth control. I encourage you to think about using that with a barrier method and spermicide because all three, they're more effective in preventing pregnancy than any one alone. Think about getting a backup supply of emergency contraception, which is different than mifepristone. It's legal in all 50 states and it's available over the counter. And think about talking to your partner or partners about vasectomies. Those are just some of the things that are at the top of my mind. I'm always willing to hear from readers about other options. And we have a wonderful post by Dr. Hall on this topic as well. So check out our website. Now, we are going to turn over to Dr. Davis again. And we are going to be talking about question 3. Somebody put definitely vasectomies. Okay, we're going back to Dr. Chana. Why is male and female an oversimplification when we discuss biological sex? And what is intersex? Okay, so it's not just me, Dr. Davis. The audience can't hear you as well. I can start talking, Chana, and then when you get this figured out, okay, we will switch back. How does that sound? Okay. Let me find, good thing we all work on these things together. Let's see. So again, we have some wonderful work on our website that has been done on this topic of biological sex by Dr. Simonek and Dr. Simonek and Hall. So check out our website. But first of all, I'll say that Let's talk about intersex. It's a general term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with a reproductive sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the typical definitions of female or male in some way. It's worth being aware that this phenomenon um, is more common than you may realize. If you cast a broader net for your definition, intersex occurs in about 1 to 2% of humans. It can be evident at birth or puberty, or you may never know. There are many different. Ah, are you
Am I
here?
back? Yes.
Yes.
Sorry about that, everyone.
It's totally fine. It's technology.
Yeah. We've all been there, right? So
Yes.
thank you for getting this started. Yeah, just I guess the broader context of like why are we talking about this is just to bring awareness to the fact that the concept of sex, the concept of male and female, is actually artificially binary, and we should be thinking a little bit more about a spectrum. And that's not arbitrary. That's actually really founded in very concrete things you can look at the DNA and anatomical level, where gender can be a little harder to wrap your head around. And we'll be talking about that next. But these are things where someone like a genetics background like myself can, I guess, shed some light on what's going on there and why male and female isn't as simple and straightforward, these two buckets that everyone can be put in as you might think of. And so, as Mary-Kathleen said, depending on how you define intersex, that could actually affect 1 to 2% of people. Some of those people don't actually know that they're affected by it because it comes in so many different forms. And some of those forms may be forms where you don't know it yourself. So let's just talk a little bit about how biological sex is determined, the different components of biological sex, and then how intersex fits into that. So at the DNA level, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes and one set from each parent, and 22 of those are called autosomes, and the last pair is a special pair called the sex chromosomes. And typically you would have an X and a Y, or two X's. Two X's would normally create someone that looked like what we think of as a typical female characteristics, and XY would normally create somebody that looks with typical male characteristics. And so what are those characteristics? When we talk about biological sex characteristics, we talk about primary and secondary characteristics. So primary are the ones you're born with, genitalia being the most evident difference between male and female babies with traditional definitions. And then secondary characteristics are the ones that develop later in life in puberty through these hormone cascades that are kind of controlled to a large extent by the information on your sex chromosomes, but it can also be influenced by other parts of your DNA. So what typically happens is that there's this alignment between according to your DNA, you are assigned this sex. According to your primary or genitalia are this sex, and if you have an XY DNA, you would have male genitalia and you would have male secondary characteristics. And if you'd have XX DNA, you would have female genitalia and female secondary characteristics. But in reality, those things are not always connected the way that we think that they are, and they're disconnected. Or non-traditionally, connected more commonly than you might recognize. So I just think that's important to be aware of, because, I think about my high school class or my middle school class, and it's just not accurate to assume everyone is wired the way that you are, or even that you are wired the way you are. One example, for example, of intersex is someone who has external genitalia of a male, but internal genitalia of a female, or vice versa. So there can be a disconnect there. There can be disconnects between your chromosomes and the secondary characteristics, because maybe your body makes testosterone, but your body doesn't have the androgen receptors to actually respond to that testosterone. So there's lots of different ways. Biologically, we understand it some of the time why there's this different alignment, but some of the times we don't understand why it's happening. So just again, the goal here of this question is really to just raise awareness that we should be thinking a little bit more about spectrum and less in terms of these black and white clear buckets that everyone falls into, because it's remarkably common to see differences from what we think of as the way is, just the way it is. It's not, that's an oversimplification. So that's all we wanted to do with this question. And we do have a post on this as well. It's about, boys and girls, and I'm going to share that link here, and how it's, and all the complexities that really should be in more people's radars. And a link to something, I think they're called the Intersex Society, have some interesting stats on how common is such and such variation. There's something called Klinefelters, which is XXY. There's something called Turner's, which is X and then no Y chromosome. There's lots of different variations, and those are, Klinefelters, for example, is 1 in 1,000 births. So, thinking about my high school, might expect somebody in there would have that. So, and I also read that on that site that the number of people receiving surgery to normalize genital appearance, because ambiguous genitalia is something we didn't talk about, is quite common. That was 1 or 2 in 1,000 births, people having surgery to make it look more like, again, it's a spectrum. Like, at what point does a penis become small enough that you say it's ambiguous, whether it's a penis or not? Like, it's all a continuum. So that's the perspective we're trying to bring. And building on that, we're going to switch gears to sex and gender now. So what is the difference between these two, and why is it so important to understand these distinct concepts?
It is an amazing question, Dr. Davis, and I'm not sure I can handle it in 5 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I am a tangential speaker, and I love to talk. So if I get off topic, will you draw me back in with some clarifying questions?
Deal.
Okay, great. Okay, great. I do think this is a rich conversation because it falls in the categories of biology, psychology, history, culture, anthropology, linguistics, political science, religion, spirituality. It can be overwhelming, and I think you can hear that when even those of us who are in the fields stumble on our words. It's because it's a very complex and rich conversation that we're having and learning. Today, we're going to talk about it in science in medical realm because we're those nerdy girls, and that's what we do. So, Dr. Davis, you discussed sort of the chromosomes behind biological sex and our physical bits and parts. And you pointed to the fact that they exist on a spectrum of sorts. It's not neatly always just one thing or another, right? This is hugely important advancement in scientific and cultural understanding. I do want to say as a caveat that many cultures across times and locations have long acknowledged and had or have language that reflects and respects this spectrum. But in our culture, we're getting better at it, recognizing it. Some of these physical bits and parts are visible, as you said, to ourselves, our external genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, and some parts are seen on ultrasound, other scans, or under specialized microscopes, like the ones you use, Dr. Chana, to look at the very small bits. But they're all physical and all able to be measured. Of note, measured or described is different than defined. And I want to say that because defining something is a dynamic process that involves linguistics, culture, norms, history. So we want to be careful about saying we're, strictly defining anything. So gender are the attitudes, feelings, behaviors that a given culture associates with biological sex. Okay. And from gender, in many languages, we have associated pronouns. In English, you're going to hear she, he, they, she, and many, many others. If you do a Google search of gender pronouns, you're going to find many. There's also gender identity. And that's our internal sense of self, regardless of what's happening around us in the culture. Sometimes regardless of what our external genitalia is, sometimes it's relevant to our external genitalia. And then there's gender expression. And that's how we express ourselves through dress, style, behavior, activities. Now, when a culture's gender definitions match a person's biological sex, we call that cisgender, and that's Latin for on this side. When they differ, we call that transgender, and that's Latin for across or on the other side. And then sometimes, as you've spoken about spectrum, gender is on a spectrum as well. And so there's some folks who move between a binary mean two, they move between They might call themselves gender nonconforming, gender fluid, non-binary, gender variant, gender neutral, agender. The words are expanding as we come to understand more and be more inclusive. So how and why do we care about both sex and gender in science and medicine? Well, let's talk about the how first. We're getting better every day, but I'm going to give you an example of like a perfect scenario. Let's say I'm setting up a study, a research study, and I'm recruiting people with testicles for a study of an oral pregnancy prevention medicine that acts on sperm. Wouldn't that be amazing if we got that on the market soon? So I am using in that recruitment, I am using very scientific and anatomical language because it's precise and inclusive, right? I'm saying acts on sperm, I'm saying people with testicles, I'm talking about pregnancy prevention. So it's important then when we're recruiting for science, we're precise and inclusive. Another example in scientific and health communication, say I'm writing for those nerdy girls a post on who needs cervical cancer screen, which I actually have done, or who needs to do a monthly testicular self-exam. I may use language appropriate for a broad public messaging campaign, like all people with cervixes age 21 to 65, or all people with testicles age 15 and up. This is important to say it in this way. Dr. Davis, why don't I want to say all women age 21 to 65?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how we get pushback sometimes for using the language pregnant person rather than pregnant woman. So that just is this where it's not a fair assumption that somebody who has a certain body part has a certain associates with a certain gender.
Yeah, it's super relevant to cervical cancer screening, which I've written on and gotten pushback on, because a cisgender woman may not have a cervix if she's had a total hysterectomy. So I wouldn't want to just assume. And I've actually had people come in and been in the middle of a cervical cancer screening and I find no cervix because no one has told them they don't need to come in for that. So it's very relevant that we, in these broad public health recommendations, we be as inclusive and precise as possible so that we don't end up with unnecessary procedures or missing someone who needs a procedure. So where does gender come in? Science communication and medical recommendations in medical care are most effective when there is shared trust between the science community and its audience, or the medical team and their patients. Trust is built by being seen, heard, respected, and honored as a full person. That includes our bits and parts and our internal sense of self. So writers, speakers, practitioners, we build trust in many ways, but one is using inclusive language when appropriate. There was a time when in formal writing and recommendations, we defaulted to the masculine pronoun he. You'll see that in the Declaration of Independence. You'll notice that our writing follows APA style and defaults to they as our singular generic third person pronoun. This is so our readers and listeners can find themselves in, regardless of their gender, in our information and recommendations. And it also is respectful of the experts that we're referring to. So we'll do this unless we know the gender or it makes sense to use the specific gender pronouns. It replaces writing his or her, which is very clunky in writing. And it respects the fact that there's the spectrum of those people who are non-binary. So I would say that accurate gender usage, gender identity usage, is also critical to improving health outcomes in the one-on-one clinical setting. At your primary care office, imagine your team's electronic medical record has your accurate name, your nickname, your honorific, your title, your biological sex, male, female, or intersex, your pronouns, where you can actually write in your pronoun if it's not listed, and your gender: cisgender woman, cisgender man, transgender woman, transgender man, non-binary, genderqueer, non-conforming, gender neutral, agender, gender fluid, etc. Language is dynamic, and so there might be things that I've missed. You will forgive me. This is what I have on the top of my head for the time that we have. But already when you are filling out your intake form, you feel seen, don't you? Now that you feel seen in this space, how much more trust is built when all the people in the building use and respect those integral parts of you. You're much more likely to participate and follow your healthcare plans. We see this in all areas of inclusion, not just gender, but in language inclusion, racial inclusion, ethnic, and ability inclusion. And if we did a quick example about you, for example, going to the doctor, Dr. Davis, imagine the negative. Imagine the team didn't use your honorific or got your gender wrong and called you Mr. Davis, or didn't pronounce your name correctly and called you Chana. Would that set you up to trust the planning care of what vaccines you need? No, but the opposite is true. If they use your honorific, if they take into account your years of study experience and knowledge and call you Dr. Davis, if they use the language that you feel comfortable with by making notes in the electronic medical record, then you actually feel seen, heard, part of the team, so to speak, a partner in your care, and are more likely to take the medical advice that is given to you. This is just an example, and I know we're short on time, but I hope
I'm going to cut you off any second now, so I'm going to give you.
I'm done. I'm done. I just want to say it's a start. It's an ongoing conversation. We're not perfect. We're doing our best, but I want to give you an idea of why we're doing what we're doing.
And I would just say that this goes beyond a message to healthcare providers, right? This is just a general being respectful to human beings thing.
In every setting, whether it be at the Thanksgiving table or the medical office.
Yep. And the more we recognize that not everyone has the same experiences, that the better we can navigate the world respectfully.
And I think you set the stage for that beautifully by talking about the biological basis for sex. But I know everybody wants to hear about chocolate, right?
Of course.
Okay. We have enough time to talk about chocolate, and I'm sorry I talked so much about gender, but get to it. Tell us about chocolate.
Okay. So let me get the question up here. This is something we posted on our page about a month ago-ish. Is it true that chocolate is unsafe due to heavy metals? So this headline came from a Consumer Reports study that found traces of heavy metals in a number of different chocolate bars. So let me start with the short answer, which is that it is true that chocolate does contain heavy metals. It depends on which brand you buy. You'd have to read the report to know which is which. But the implication is not no chocolate ever. The implication is be mindful of intake, and I want to explore that a bit more. So really, actually, what I want to talk about is an overarching theme of all things toxicology, which is the dose makes the poison, and that we shouldn't really be thinking about foods as, yes and no, but what's a safe and reasonable amount of this substance. So let's get into that. So the study, they looked at 28 different chocolate bars, and they measured a couple of different things. I'm going to talk about cadmium just as a kind of working example. And so they measured levels of cadmium in 28 different brands, and they found and lead. And then of 23 of 28 bars had lead or cadmium at some detectable level. And so that leaves 5 bars that had no detectable lead, no detectable cadmium. So this gives you a sense, I think they picked these bars at random, that most chocolate bars are going to have some amount of lead or some amount of cadmium in them. Again, so does that mean I should never eat dark chocolate? And for me, the answer is no. And I'll tell you how I reached the answer. No, the answer is I don't have to forbid myself chocolate, right? The answer is chocolate is still okay. Let's talk about, how much and how we think about how much. So to answer that question, you need to know how much cadmium, how much lead, and how did the amount in those foods compare to what we know to be a safe amount? And because every chemical, that we encounter that's in foods has been studied and has some defined safe threshold. And so what I did when I saw this report is I looked at when they said it had unsafe amounts, that some of them had unsafe amounts, how many of them had unsafe amounts, and are we talking about like 10 times higher than the safe limit or 1% higher than the safe limit? Are we talking about what does detectable really mean? And what I learned is that the top 2 bars out of 28 had about 2 times what was considered the safe daily limit. So if you are someone who eats chocolate in a single serving, if you're someone who eats chocolate every day, it wouldn't be great to be eating those 2 brands that happen to be twice the level. Most of the other ones were below what's considered a safe amount. So it was there, but it was low enough that it wouldn't really affect personally my purchasing decision. And so that's where we're at. It's like there were a couple of bars where the levels were high enough to be concerning for people who consume it daily. And I mentioned this headline to my son, and he said, "Does that mean we shouldn't have Halloween?" And I said, "No. What it means is you need to be thinking about when these safe limits are set. They're set in the context of daily for years, daily consumption for years. So this is not an amount that if you consume it in one day, that's a problem, because there's a different amount. There's every compound has a chronic safe limit and then an acute, like one dose, what would it take to overdose safe limit. So they're measuring them against, that's important to note, they're measuring them against like what's the amount that you could have every day and get in trouble or not get into trouble. So you can still have Halloween, you can still go nuts, a couple times a year. But if you're someone who consumes a considerable amount of chocolate every day, that's someone who I think it might be worth actually double clicking and seeing which brands maybe were the red flag brands, because there was just a handful of them. So most brands had low enough levels that it's not enough to impact my purchasing decisions. There were a handful that did, and it would only really be a relevant thing to look up if you were someone who consumes dark chocolate on a daily basis. Dark chocolate has higher amounts because it comes from the cocoa plant, and because the plant soaks it up from the soil. So nobody's adding it and contaminating it. It's just that it's just a part of the soil. I think there are some processes that humans do contribute to heavy metal contamination of soils, but there's a lot of it that comes not from humans, from volcanic activity, so whether or not a chocolate bar has high levels of these heavy metals, you can't really predict it yourself, because it's not about whether it's organic or not. It's more related to the geographic region and what's in that region of volcanoes and so on. So we can't really just guess which brands are going to be higher and low. You'd have to read the report to say these are the couple of ones I would want to avoid. So what else do I want to say about that? I guess just stepping back one more layer to reading these toxic headlines in general. And I think it's important to bear in mind that often there's an incentive to make it sound as scary as possible, because that gets clicks, right? And Consumer Reports is actually, that's their business, right? They want you to say, oh, I better read the report to see which ones not to buy, right? So they're trying to make it as scary as possible. And in fact, one element of this chocolate report that made me a little bit less scared than I was initially is when I dug a little bit deeper and I realized that, so like I said, that whether or not it's the concern depends on, it's not, so detectable doesn't always mean red flag, right? So detectable is not an issue if the safe amount is way up here and detectable is down here, right? But so the safe threshold for a compound is documented, and there's an official safe threshold. So for cadmium, for example, Canada has a documented safe threshold. Europe has a documented safe threshold. The WHO does. The CDC does. FDA does. So all these organizations have these safe thresholds, and they're not always identical, because they're looking at a body of data and saying, what do we think is a tolerable amount of this substance? And the cutoff that they used in this study to say how much chocolate is too much was super conservative. And of course they want to do that because it makes it as scary as possible, right? But this was a weird one where there was the safe threshold that they used in the study was from California Prop 65. And the number that they used there was 4 micrograms per day. And that number is about 10 to 20 times lower than the safe limit at every other organization I looked at. And so if you were defining safe according to Health Canada or WHO or Europe, these chocolate bars would not have been on the radar. They're only on the radar because they chose to use the most conservative cutoff they could find, which is not a crazy thing to do. But this one, anyways, for me, it kind of stood out that the safe threshold they used was wildly lower than every other organization's safe threshold. So Canada wouldn't have raised it. If the government of Canada did this and used their own standard, these chocolate bars would have been, So
thank you for protecting the enjoyment of chocolate.
Yes. So, this is not the kind of headline that I'm going to go share to everyone, but I did actually share it with someone in my family who is the biggest chocoholic I know and consumes probably like a generous portion of chocolate every day. So there's one person I chose to share it with, and very selectively because I think she consumes enough where it might actually matter which brand she consumes. And one other piece of context here is just letting go of zero risk as what we'll tolerate, because cadmium, again, if we're focusing on chocolate here, but you want to take a broader look at cadmium. If really what you care about is, you should be asking, what can I do to minimize my cadmium exposure overall, or heavy metals? Smoking is the number one thing you can do. So like if you're smoking but quitting chocolate, that just makes no sense. So do the things that give you the most bang for your buck. And also, the cadmium levels in plant-based, and a number of different plant-based foods are probably going to be on par with a bunch of those chocolate bars, just because plants absorb cadmium. And so we're just shining a light on this one thing that happens on this one plant, but it's actually more common than you realize. So we just need to always try to get a bit of context before you say, oh, chocolate's bad, right? Mm-hmm. And I will going to drop two as we wrap up. Last thing, this is the last thing we're going to share. I'm going to drop these two links. One is to an article on the Nerdy Girls page about, is chocolate unsafe? And then the last thing is another great series I recommend from the Sci Moms. Allison Bernstein, who's a toxicologist, is one of the Sci Moms, and she has a great series called Risk in Perspective, and talks about some of these basic concepts of how we think about risk, and that safety really is all relative. Everything's on a continuum, and we need to think about, where are we relative to the safe dose, not zero, right? I think that's all I wanted to share today. I hope this was helpful for sex, gender, chocolate, and and all things. So thank you for joining us, and please submit your questions to our website at thosenerdygirls.org. You can also sign up there for our Substack newsletter to make sure that you stay up to date on all of our posts. My tongue's not working anymore, so I guess we're done.
Thank you so much for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
And it was great to partner with you, Dr. Davis.
Thanks for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. See you again next time.